I guard the hum of wires and flow of pipes against the foreign hand that strikes the keys. While hackers reach for gears and glowing stripes, I face a cut that brings me to my knees. Because I watch the words and ballots cast, the White House seeks to rein my mandate in. They trade the future for a grievance past and strip the funds that keep our systems thin. A massive sum, 700 million lost, to settle scores on social media's stage. The power grid and water pay the cost, as emotion dictates this modern age. If federal help is stretched and cast away, the burden falls on those who keep the light. Who am I in this fiscal dark display, the shield that's failing in the coming fight? Welcome back to CyberSecureOT. I'm your host, Dennis, and today we are diving into a high-stakes lineup that explores the fragile intersection of politics, software supply chains, and municipal defense. We have a lot to cover, so let's get into the 4 segments that every critical infrastructure defender needs to hear. We start with a hypothetical cautionary tale titled "The Day the Screens Went Dark." This narrative simulates a worst-case forefront coordinated assault by Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea against our power, water, logistics, and healthcare systems. It's a sobering look at how a gutted federal budget could leave the nation paralyzed, illustrating that asset owners simply cannot rely on political stability alone to keep the lights on. All CISOs should be able to relate to this type of cost-cutting in their organizations. Next, we break down a very real supply chain attack involving the official CPUID website. In early April 2026, trusted diagnostic tools such as CPUZ were replaced by a sophisticated remote access Trojan. We'll discuss why an instrumentation tech downloading a simple temperature monitor could inadvertently hand over the keys to a SCADA network, and how network segmentation is your best defense against these indirect threat vectors. Our third segment takes us to Winona County, Minnesota, which recently suffered its second major ransomware attack in just 3 months. The situation became so dire that the governor had to deploy the National Guard's cyber protection team. This case is a textbook example of why IT breaches are a direct threat to OT, as municipalities often have to blind themselves by taking systems offline to prevent ransomware from jumping into things like water treatment and power controls. And finally, we wrap up with a look at the fiscal year 2027 U.S. budget proposal, which includes a staggering $707 million cut to CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. The administration is seeking to rein in the agency due to disputes over election misinformation programs. However, we'll explore why critics fear this move throws the baby out with the bathwater, potentially sacrificing the nation's primary defense for power grids and pipelines just to settle a political score. It's a heavy episode, but staying informed is your first line of defense. So let's get started. We open this episode with a CyberSecureOT story titled "The Day the Screens Went Dark." The fictional stories featured on this CyberSecureOT podcast serve as a powerful matter-of-fact tool to illustrate the severe, real-world consequences of operational technology vulnerabilities. By simulating worst-case scenarios, such as coordinated strikes on power grids and water facilities, these narratives highlight that the threat landscape for critical infrastructure is currently at an unprecedented level of assault. Ultimately, the stories underscore a crucial reality. Asset owners and plant managers cannot rely entirely on federal resources or political stability to ensure their security. Instead, these scenarios underscore the urgent need for private industry to independently adopt secure-by-design principles, build robust incident response capabilities, and implement reliable, cost-effective frameworks to protect vital infrastructure from catastrophic kinetic impacts. And so it begins. The attack was carried out on a freezing Tuesday in November of 2027. For months, defenders of critical infrastructure had warned that the fiscal year 2027 U.S. budget proposal, which gutted the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency by a staggering $707 million, was a catastrophic mistake. The massive reduction to CISA's overall operating budget drastically reduced their bandwidth for providing threat intelligence, incident response, and vulnerability sharing. When the coordinated attack finally came, the federal cavalry that the nation had long relied upon was stretched incredibly thin, rendering it virtually powerless to stop. The forefront assault. The attack was not a single brute force strike, but a meticulously choreographed assault by 4 distinct nation-state actors who saw an unprecedented window of vulnerability. The Russian front, power. At 2 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Russian state-sponsored groups executed a simultaneous attack on programmable logic controllers across the Eastern Interconnection. Because these operational technology attacks allowed hackers to manipulate physical machinery, massive power substations began to overload and shut down. Within an hour, they had successfully shut off power to the entire Northeast region. The Iranian front, water and wastewater. As the grid collapsed, Iranian operatives infiltrated municipal water supplies across the Midwest and West Coast. Exploiting unpatched zero-day vulnerabilities in industrial control systems that CISA previously would have caught, the hackers altered the chemical mix in local water reservoirs, pumping toxic levels of chlorine and fluoride into the public supply. The Chinese front, transportation and logistics. By dawn, Chinese cyber units systematically and critically disrupted supply chains and transportation networks. Traffic control systems in major metropolitan areas were scrambled. Rail switches were locked, and automated port logistics were wiped clean, instantly freezing the movement of all goods. The North Korean front, healthcare and government. Capitalizing on the chaos, North Korean syndicates launched crippling ransomware attacks against hospitals, emergency dispatch centers, and local municipalities. With CISA's resources for helping local municipalities practically non-existent, 911 networks went dark, and hospitals lost access to digital records, life support telemetry, and diagnostic imaging. The short-term fallout, a nation paralyzed. The immediate aftermath was sheer pandemonium. Without power grids, hospitals, and pipelines functioning, the death toll spiked rapidly within the first 72 hours. Patients in ICUs died as backup generators failed. Tens of thousands of citizens fell violently ill from an undetected chemical alteration in their drinking water before emergency broadcast networks could issue boil and ban advisories. Urban centers descended into gridlock. With no functioning traffic lights and frozen public transit, the lack of CISA-provided threat intelligence left private industry plant managers and OT security engineers completely blind, forcing them to physically sever connections and operate plants manually, and to heavily segment their networks just to survive. The long-term fallout, the cost of the dispute. Months later, the U.S. economy fell. It was in free fall. The predicted cost of physical damage and supply chain disruption soared past $4 trillion. The stock market had to be suspended for 3 weeks, and when it reopened, the dollar's value plummeted. Internationally, the United States' status as an unassailable superpower evaporated overnight. Allies looked on in horror as the global titan was brought to its knees not by missiles, but by code. Security experts and objective critics looked back at the strategy with bitter clarity. The federal government had effectively sacrificed national security for a dispute. The administration had gutted the agency's budget to penalize a specific program regarding election misinformation, choosing to settle a score over social media monitoring at the expense of defending the nation's vital systems. It was, as critics have warned, the textbook definition of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The nation lost the fight. All U.S. citizens were no longer free, no free trade, no free commerce. A complete rebuild was necessary, and the winners, the attackers, held all the resources, power, water, healthcare, and local governments. They held the order, the power, and the control. Now, this has been a CyberSecureOT story created with assistance from Gemini. The events were made up and completely hypothetical. Continue on to hear the latest in critical infrastructure cybersecurity news. Now we're going to take a very real and important leap away from the CISA news, which we will revisit later in this podcast episode. And we're going to talk about some major events that happened over the past week. If you work in IT or OT, you're likely familiar with tools like CPUID and HWMonitor or HWMonitor. They are the go-to utilities for checking hardware specs, monitoring thermals, and diagnostic hardware faults. When we talk about hardware, we're talking about like servers and computer infrastructure. But between April 9th and 10th, 2026, the official CPUID website was hijacked. Today, we're going to break down exactly what happened, how a side channel API compromise turned trusted downloads into a delivery mechanism for a remote access Trojan or a RAT, and most importantly, why this matters for critical infrastructure environments, the ones we defend, from power generation and water treatment facilities to even oil and gas. To understand the threat, we first have to understand the attack mechanisms. According to incident reports from Bleeping Computer, The Register, Tech Power Up, and others, the attackers didn't breach the core development environment of CPUID. The official software binaries for CPUID and HWMonitor, they remained untouched and properly signed. Instead, the threat actors compromised a secondary feature, a side API on the CPUID website backend. For about 6 hours, if an engineer went to the site to download CPUID version 2.19 or HWMonitor version 1.63, the site randomly redirected them to a malicious Cloudflare R2 storage bucket. Some of this gets kind of technical. You can read more about it in the notes. So what did they download? Not CPUID. They received a deeply Trojanized installer cleverly disguised as HWinfo_monitor_setup.exe. Kind of looks similar. It used an INO setup wrapper, which is a highly unusual wrapper for a CPUID tool, and it kicked off a deeply sophisticated infection chain. So when executed, the installer drops a legitimate signed executable alongside a malicious DLL named cryptbase.dll. This is a classic DLL sideloading attack. So if you're going to do some searching, look up like DLL sideloading attacks. It'll help you to understand what's going on. But because this executable was trusted, Windows loads the malicious DLL without raising an immediate red flag. From there, the malware is remarkably stealthy. Security analysts noted that it operates almost entirely in memory. So using PowerShell and bypasses endpoint detection and response completely, these solutions don't even pick it up because there's proxying with NTDLL functionality through a .NET assembly. It's kind of technical, like I said. Eventually, it establishes a command and control connection and drops its final payload. So this is what happens. It drops this STX RAT. Remote Access Trojan. This is an information stealer that specifically targets browser data. It even goes so far as to interact with Google Chrome's iElevation COM interface, and that is what's used to decrypt stored credentials. Now, you might be thinking, Dennis, this sounds like an IT problem. We don't run HWMonitor on our PLCs, and you'd mostly be right, although there are some programmable logic controllers that run on Windows. But let's zoom out and look at the actual architecture of a modern industrial site. Think about the engineering workstations. Those are computers. And the human-machine interfaces. These are Windows-based systems. They run in a harsh high humidity environment. There's, dust, they're unair conditioned, and they're subject to like intense vibration. When an HMI enclosure starts throwing temperature warnings, or a legacy engineering workstation is acting kind of sluggish, what do you think that the tech does? They download a diagnostic tool to check the CPU temps and voltages. CPUID and HWMonitor are arguably the most popular tools to do that exact job. According to Kaspersky's telemetry following the CPUID breach, while most victims were individuals, several organizations in the manufacturing, telecommunications, and agricultural sectors downloaded the malicious variant. Yes, they know who's downloading it. So if a control systems engineer inadvertently installs the STX rat on an engineering workstation, the consequences could be severe. This malware is an info stealer. It grabs credentials saved in browsers and system memory, like I mentioned earlier, the Chrome browser. In an OT environment, those credentials often include administrative access to Active Directory domains, virtual private network gateways, and these are in that industrial control system network. They could also be grabbing direct logon credentials for SCADA, or supervisory control and data acquisition servers. And I know what you're going to say, we don't turn browsers on, we don't use browsers. Well, most SCADA and advanced applications run in a web browser. And the most common web browser is Google Chrome. So once the threat actors have those credentials, they no longer need to hack into the critical infrastructure. They just log in. And we've talked about this over the past few episodes. That's a signature of living off the land. And that's what threat actors like the Iranian threat actors do. They can move laterally from an engineering workstation directly into an operational technology tier, manipulating set points, disabling safety instrument and systems if they're connected, or dropping ransomware specifically designed to halt industrial processes. We are looking at a scenario where a simple attempt to check why a fan is failing could lead to a complete operational shutdown of something like a pipeline. So how do we protect our industrial environments from an attack where the legitimate vendor's website is the infection vector? It requires a disciplined approach to security program management. We need solutions that are cost-effective, operational, reliable, and efficient. That was a plug for my core program. First, we must enforce strict application control, often referred to as allow listing, on all HMI's engineering workstations and historians. Those are the servers that collect all the process data, things that are going on in the physical process. An OT environment is deterministic. We know exactly what software needs to run for the plant to operate. This is a known. An unknown executable, even if it claims to be a diagnostic tool, simply should not be allowed to execute without administrative review. Second, we have to look at how files enter the OT network. Engineers should not be browsing the internet directly from an engineering workstation on the plant floor. We need a secure file transfer mechanism, a demilitarized zone where files downloaded from our IT network are staged, scanned with multiple antivirus engines, and verified against published cryptographic hashes before they are ever moved onto the OT environment. The attackers changed the download link, but the hash of the malicious file wouldn't match the official CPUID release. And lastly, we need robust network segmentation and credential hygiene. The STX rat relies on connecting to a command and control server. If your engineering workstation doesn't have a direct route to the internet, that connection fails, effectively neutering the malware. Furthermore, prohibiting the storage of privileged credentials in web browsers reduces the blast radius if an info stealer does manage to slip through and it has the capability to steal web browser credentials. Supply chain attacks like the CPUID compromise highlight a crucial reality. Our threat landscape is expanding, and adversaries are targeting the very tools we use to maintain our systems. By applying rigorous foundational security practices, we can ensure that our critical infrastructure remains resilient against these types of indirect threat vectors. All right, so that's all the time we have for this segment. For a full breakdown of the indicators of compromise and the links to the research from Bleeping Computer, The Register, Tech Power Up, and others, check out the show notes. Now we investigate a disturbing and growing trend, the relentless targeting of local governments by cybercriminals. Specifically, we're looking at breaking news from the Midwest that highlights exactly what happens when municipal networks come under siege and how this directly threatens our critical infrastructure. For this deep dive, I'm pulling from extensive reporting by NPR News, the Star Tribune, Bring Me the News, The Record, and CBS News Minnesota. If you want the ground level reporting, I highly recommend checking out their coverage, which is linked in the show notes. Our focus today is on Winona County, Minnesota. It's a county of about 50,000 people and has just suffered its second major ransomware attack this year, the second attack in 3 months to be exact. And if you wonder why this made my episode, it's because it's all over the news. Let's lay out the timeline based on the reports. On Monday, April 6, 2026, Winona County experienced a massive cyber attack on its IT network that continued into Tuesday, April 7th. According to the statements from Winona County Administrator Maureen Holt, they had to take down affected systems, and this was because of an abundance of caution. They didn't want it to spread. When a local government goes offline, the real-world impact is immediate. So CBS News and local outlets reported that while emergency 911 dispatch, fire, and law enforcement services remained completely operational, essential citizen services like the DMV and vital statistics went completely dark. And I think, no, not the DMV. Staff literally had to resort to pen and paper to keep bare bones operations moving, meaning those who waited till the last minute to update their licenses, they were seriously rethinking their life choices. But what makes this case stand out? And why are we talking about it here on an OT podcast? And that's because of the state response. The scale and complexity of this ransomware attack were so severe that it exceeded the county's internal and commercial response capabilities. Governor Tim Walz had to declare a state of emergency and deploy the Minnesota National Guard cyber protection team. It's a fascinating escalation. According to the Record and Bring Me the News, a 15-person team of military cyber experts led by Lieutenant Colonel Brian Morgan was sent in to essentially do battlefield triage on a county government network. They're working alongside the FBI, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and the state IT services. And it's kind of similar, it's kind of familiar to me because when I was in the Louisiana Air National Guard, we were just spinning up a cyber division. Cyber services and this capability really didn't exist. It was just starting to get spun up. So it's interesting to see where that's come over the past 25 plus years, where states can actually rely on their National Guard cyber divisions to investigate these types of attacks. But now when we hear about an attack on a county's IT systems, things like DMV records and email services, why does that set off alarm bells for operational technology and critical infrastructure? Let's get back to the topic. It's a crucial question. When people think of local government, they think of paperwork, but municipal governments operate local critical infrastructure. We are talking about water and wastewater treatment plants, municipal power distribution, traffic management systems, and the physical building automation systems for emergency operations centers. These are physical processes controlled by operational technologies. And traditionally, those OT networks were air-gapped, meaning they weren't connected to the internet or the main IT network. But over the last decade, for the sake of efficiency and remote monitoring, IT and OT have completely converged. And now an OT engineer might log into a water treatment plant's dashboard using the same enterprise computer that they use to check their email. So when a ransomware group breaches a county's IT network, the immediate fear is lateral movement. Attackers can use the IT network as a bridge to jump into the OT network. This is where they can manipulate valves at a water facility, alter chemical levels, or shut down the local power grid if they play their cards right. This perfectly explains the county's reaction. Administrator Holt mentioned taking systems offline out of an abundance of caution, quote unquote. As we've seen in the past attacks, like the Colonial Pipeline incident a few years ago, organizations often shut down their physical operations, not because the physical OT systems are infected, but because they have to sever the bridge to prevent the ransomware from reaching the physical systems. They blind themselves to protect their infrastructure. Now let's talk about the adversaries here. NPR News interviewed John Israel, the state of Minnesota's Chief Information Security Officer, CISA. He noted that threat actors are incredibly adept at hacking humans. Yeah, I bet you could get hacked. You are a human. I'm talking to you, the listener. So now they aren't just locking systems anymore. They are exfiltrating data first. They steal the data, they lock the system, and they demand a ransom, not just for decryption, but to prevent public release of sensitive citizen data. It's called double extortion. And you let them in. And local governments are prime targets. Jonathan Rolstad, a cybersecurity professor at the University of Minnesota, pointed out to CBS News why local governments are in the crosshairs. Unlike massive Fortune 500 companies, counties don't have massive IT budgets, yet they provide services that are absolutely vital to day-to-day life. They cannot afford downtime. Threat actors know this. They view local governments as low-hanging fruit with high pressure to pay up. Unfortunately, this isn't an isolated incident. The Star Tribune and NPR News pointed out that this is a widespread trend. So just last summer in 2025, the city of St. Paul suffered a massive ransomware incident where 43 gigabytes of data were stolen, forcing the city to shut parts of its network off. The National Guard had to be deployed for that one too. The 2025 Minnesota Cybersecurity Incident Report logged 269 incidents in public entities in just 1 year. Which brings us to the defense strategy. How do we protect critical municipal infrastructure from these IT breaches? Winona County Emergency Management Director Ben Klinger noted that the National Guard isn't just there to restore files, they are there to hunt for vulnerabilities and harden the network. For any IT or OT professionals listening who work in local government, what actionable takeaways can be drawn from this Winona County incident? First, strict network segmentation. You have to assume your IT network will be breached. When an employee in an HR department clicks a phishing link, there need to be hardened firewalls, demilitarized zones, you're going to hear DMZ a lot, and strict access controls to prevent malware from ever reaching OT environments controlling a city's water supply. Second, this is according to CISO John Israel, robust offline backups. If your backups are connected to the same main network, the ransomware will encrypt those too. You need immutable offline backups so you can wipe your systems and restore them without paying a dime to the attackers. And third is incident response planning. Winona County survived because it knew exactly who to call. They had a plan. They didn't just scramble. They immediately contacted the FBI, state cyber resources, and eventually requested the National Guard. So knowing how to manually operate your critical infrastructure, literally having the pen and paper or manual valve tuning procedure ready, is the ultimate and probably only ultimate failsafe. As we wrap up this segment, the situation in Winona County is a stark reminder. The front line of cyber warfare isn't just in the cloud or at the Pentagon. It's at your local DMV. It could be your county courthouse and your municipal water plant. The attackers only have to be right one time to succeed. Local governments and cyber defenders have to be right 100% of the time. So we wish the IT and emergency management teams in Winona County the best of luck as they continue their recovery efforts. I would like to think of them as part of my target audience. Again, check the show notes for the links and the excellent reporting on this incident. And finally, we round this up with something that could be slightly controversial. So I have to preface this final piece by stating that we, critical infrastructure defenders, take a pragmatic, unbiased position, leaving politics and party lines at the door to provide a matter-of-fact view of events. No one party is viewed as better or worse than any other. They do their thing, and we just have to defend the systems. We are dedicating this final piece to a major development out of Washington that has the entire operational technology community on high alert. If you work in critical infrastructure, you need to pay attention to this because it directly impacts the resources we rely on to keep the lights on and the water running. We're talking about the newly released fiscal year 2027 U.S. budget proposal. If you've been scanning the news lately, reading through TechCrunch Security Magazine, the official whitehouse.gov fiscal year 2027 budget documents, this was all released. You've likely seen the headlines over the last week. The new administration budget proposes a staggering $707 million cut to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, commonly known as CISA. That document is linked in the notes for this episode. And when you read that section, it's under Department of Homeland Safety or Security. You'll note exactly what the reason is. And so that's why I bring this up. It's in the rationale for this is actually in the document. So I'm not making this up. Let's put all of this into perspective. So taking over $700 million out of CISA's operating budget, as noted in the reports from ASIS International and AFCEA, is a massive operational reduction. It drastically reduces their bandwidth. And what they do is CISA provides threat intelligence, incident response support, and vulnerability sharing. They do this for both public and private sectors. And CISA kind of plussed up during Colonial Pipeline because at that point in time, that pipeline system was shut down, and CISA was an organization that had already put together safeguards for pipeline security. Well, they implemented the Department of Homeland Security's pipeline guidelines. There was actually an executive order that came out, and organizations have to follow those guidelines to their security directives to secure their networks, to protect those pipelines. Well, when that happened, we realized as a government that we had to do a lot of different things. We had to find alternate means to move fuel. We had to use other types of shipping organizations. This actually greatly impacted the Transportation Security Agency and our maritime sectors. It even went to our maritime administration to be able to ship fuel from the south to the east coast. So there was a big impact on this, and CISA was in the forefront helping, along with some other private sector firms and the FBI and others. So this is a massive hit when we see that this organization that was so paramount during a large event like that is being cut. And the timing of this proposed cut, that's exactly what has asset owners and cybersecurity professionals scratching our heads, right? We are currently living in an era where critical infrastructure is under an unprecedented level of cyber assault. And how does it make sense to pull funding from our primary cyber defense agency right now? And a lot of people say it doesn't. It just doesn't make sense. Just look at the threat landscape over the last few years, specifically over the last couple of months. We've seen repeated alerts regarding nation-state actors, including state-sponsor groups out of Iran and China, specifically targeting programmable logic controllers in the U.S. energy and water sectors. These aren't just your standard IT breaches in which customer data or credit card numbers are stolen. These are OT, operational technology attacks. When hackers compromise a PLC in a water treatment plant or a power substation, they are manipulating physical machinery. They can shut off power to a region, alter the chemical mix in a municipal water supply, or critically disrupt supply chains. Given that harsh reality, slashing the budget of the agency tasked with helping private industry defend these vital systems feels incredibly counterintuitive. There's not another agency that does that. So that brings us to the big question. The big question is why? Why cut funding for cybersecurity when threats to our physical infrastructure are at an all-time high? To understand the administration's motivation behind the budget proposal, we have to look at the political context outlined in recent reports from Tech Republic and TechCrunch. And again, I try to keep politics out of this, but this is very compelling. According to the administration's stated rationale, this is in the budget document, the cuts are a direct response to CISA's previous work involving election security and misinformation. The White House claims that this is a retaliatory effort. CISA overstepped in its mandate, and that its election misinformation tracking programs were politically biased and used to target the president. Doesn't say anything about the public, doesn't say anything about the people. It says one person. Essentially, the administration is arguing that a federal cybersecurity agency shouldn't be involved in monitoring domestic social media content or policing online speech under the umbrella of combating disinformation. To stop that specific activity and rein in the agency, the administration has proposed this massive reduction in CISA's overall operating budget. So this leads us to the debate currently raging in the cybersecurity world. Is this a wise move? I apologize. This seems kind of contentious to some listeners. From an objective security standpoint, the consensus is a resounding no. Even critics who agree that CISA shouldn't be involved in monitoring social media, they argue that using a $700 million budget cut to solve that grievance is a disproportionate and highly dangerous strategy. And so this is where we can look at it, be completely unbiased. This is the only organization, CISA is the only organization that protects us or helps us protect against these types of nation-state cyber actors. So it's kind of disproportionate. It's a textbook definition of, like we said before, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Critics and security experts argue that this motivation is unwise because it sacrifices national security. CISA's election security initiatives were just one fraction of what the agency does, a very small fraction. And they review it because it does impact the public. So it falls into that public mandate. The vast majority of the resources are dedicated to things like patching zero-day vulnerabilities in industrial control systems, sharing classified threat intelligence with power companies, and helping local municipalities defend against crippling ransomware attacks. By gutting the agency's budget in a way to penalize that specific program, you're simultaneously degrading the nation's ability to defend its own power grids, hospitals, and pipelines, the things that people rely on. So from a purely operational risk standpoint, risking catastrophic real-world kinetic impacts from a nation-state hacker just to settle a score over social media monitoring, it seems like a very dangerous trade-off. It's a classic case of political friction and how this is having a tangible, potential devastating impact on our operational security. And this is why I wish the government would, or just could, leave politics out of policy. It's important to remember that this is just a budget proposal for now. So it's not 100% final. Congress ultimately holds the purse strings, and we will see how this plays out on Capitol Hill. But if you did not know this was happening, please at least read the budget proposal. It is linked in my notes so you can formulate your own view on it. It does specifically explain why the budget cuts are there, and it does seem like it's retaliatory. But the immediate takeaway for you. So the plant managers, the OT security engineers, the critical infrastructure operators listening to this is that you cannot rely entirely on the federal cavalry. That is a known fact, and this just emphasizes that. If these FY2027 cuts become a reality, federal reassurances will be stretched incredibly thin, which means the burden falls heavily on private industry to adopt secure by design principles, heavily segment their networks, and invest in their own threat hunting and incident response capabilities. And yes, you cannot take that for granted. It may go away. So we'll keep tracking the budget negotiations as they develop. For the full budget proposal and all the articles referenced, refer to the notes. All right, now that's all we have for today's episode. You are now in the know. Wow your boss with this new information that you've learned. If you're in cybersecurity, they're going to think you know what you're talking about. You can wow your coworkers. They might think you know what you're talking about too. You can try to impress your spouse and your friends with your big cyber genius brain, and we know they'll just shut you down. But this is Dennis, and I'm asking you to stay aware, listen in every week, and let me know if you have any questions. I'd be open to sharing a recording of you asking a question if it's less than 20 seconds on my next episode of CyberSecure OT.